Okay, the topic is go the extra mile, manage your stockpiles and staging areas. Now you may be thinking that stockpiles, oh, I just throw a piece of plastic over it and biosocks and be done with it. There's a little more to it than that. Since Brand already introduced me, skip that. These are some of the things we're going to go through. In order to understand stockpiles, you need to understand a little bit about staging areas. And we're also going to talk a little bit about some special requirements for some special stockpiles and some other staging area requirements. When I say staging area, I'm also talking about laydown yards, base yards, stockpile area, whatever you want to call it. Everybody calls it something different. I'm just going to use the general term staging area. Some general requirements. Your staging area must be identified in your SWIP. A lot of times in development, we say, well, we're going to put our staging areas, it's somewhere within the project site as approved by the project engineer or words to that effect. Also, a lot of times in the template, I'll see in there stockpile not anticipated, which means you cannot stockpile on your project unless you amend your plan. The area of your staging area is included in your disturbed area, and it's cumulative. If you're adding more staging areas as you go, but you're closing others, it doesn't matter. It's still cumulative for all the areas. So keep that in mind, especially if you're a project under an acre and you start adding staging areas. If you go over an acre, you've just gone into the permit process and layout. This is a general example of using one of the satellite images to identify the layout or where you're going to put your staging area. And on the left or the right, as you're looking at it, is the layout of the staging area. This includes things like perimeter control, construction entrance, that sort of thing. Paving projects are very long and linear. A lot of times the paving equipment will be staged along the length of the project because you don't want to take your paving equipment 6 miles down the road to start paving. You're going to intersperse them along the project site. In terms of layout, you can put a standard layout in your plan. This is how we're going to lay out the equipment on the side of the road. But you must identify the specific areas in your SWIP. A lot of times these areas are not identified when you initially do your SWIP. You're going to wait and find out where the best place to put the paving equipment is, so you need to amend your plan. Stockpile areas. If you have a dedicated stockpile area, it can be as simple as putting a square on the plans to show the location. Again, these must be identified areas in your SWIP, but you still have to have a layout of that area. Some of the things you have to include in layout. You have to include perimeter control. If you look at section 209, it must include stabilized construction entrance at all points that exit onto a paved road. This is in your SWIP, it's in 209, it's in your special provisions. There's also mention of it in Appendix C of 11-55. And we'll talk a little bit about entrances a little bit later. Perimeter controls are separate from all your other controls in your staging area. They're not one and the same. DOH, if they ever go out to your project, is going to look for a layered approach of BMPs. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. You have a stockpile area inside a staging area. What they did here was take the perimeter control and use it as stockpile perimeter control. See, there's some dirt peeking out down there. The slope is down towards the right. On the right side slide, you see their correction, where the stockpile perimeter control is separate from the perimeter control. Again, a layered approach. Stockpiles are created from land clearing. They're or just sediment, soil from your excavation. They also include what we commonly refer to as spoil piles. Any pile that contains a lot of fines or dirt that can be blown or washed away is considered a stockpile, and it's what we're going to be talking about today. There must be protection of these stockpiles if they're on site for multiple days. A multiple day is more than one. So you get a load of topsoil today, but you don't use it all. Tonight you have to cover it. Also, when we talk about wind erosion, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, if you happen to be under a viaduct, that doesn't mean your cover is in place. Some of the viaducts, we have a lot of wind under there, and a dust fence will not specifically solve the problem. These are some of the special types of stockpiles that we have encountered on some of the projects, and I'll get into that a little bit later. General requirements: cover, perimeter control, and you have to consider the location. Cover. This is for both rain and wind. You need to cover it with plastic if practical. You notice the one in the upper right-hand corner. That is an extremely large stockpile. That contractor probably cleared out the supply of blue plastic tarps on this island, but he managed to cover it. On the bottom left, obviously this mountain is not really conducive to being covered with plastic. So they hydromulched it. That works with tactifier. You need to include the tactifier in the hydromulch. This is great for wind erosion. It does do some control for erosion. It will not solve all the erosion problems, especially in heavy downpours. Perimeter control. Actually, the best place to put your perimeter control is about a foot or two from your pile. That allows the water to pond behind whatever you're using as perimeter control and allows the sediment to come out. However, we have not been dinging contractors for placing their perimeter control on the end of the plastic to hold it down. That is provided that the entire pile is covered. In the upper right, this is an example of using an item that is not appropriate to the task. They took some matting, rolled it up, and used that as perimeter control. But also notice where it is. This is a prime example of putting the perimeter control away from the stockpile. Had there been a heavy rain, that perimeter control would not have held anything. Location, away from concentrated flow. That means look at your project. If you have even a natural swale, don't stick the pile in the middle of that area. The B&P manual says 50 feet away from concentrated flow. Obviously, that's not possible on some of our projects. The entire project isn't even 50 feet wide. You need to consider surrounding vegetation, especially trees. We have a very active outdoor circle here. Trust me, the outdoor circle is worse to deal with than DOH. There is a preserving existing vegetation in the manual, SM16, which means you set a perimeter around the tree stand out to the drip line. The drip line is the edge of the canopy. So keep that in mind when you're setting up your staging areas also. Here are some examples of problems. This particular contractor used some plywood to hold up his spoil pile. Has a nice vegetative buffer, but beyond those trees, there's a concrete ditch. The little blue arrow down at the bottom is pointing to where the biosock is, right under all the plywood. If that plywood gives way, it's just going to act as a chute over top that biosock on its way to the ditch. This upper left-hand corner, there are a number of problems here. They use soil to hold down the plastic. There's no perimeter control. It's right amongst the trees. There is a ditch down here that could act as essentially some perimeter control because it's 2 to 3 feet deep. But there's nothing on the top either. And this one on the bottom, they've actually piled the pile up against the tree. You need to have vegetative setbacks, and that's defined as a drip line. Let's talk about rock. You get all manner of sizes of rock on your project. Little rock, big rock. Rock piles may also need to be covered, especially if they have a lot of fines on it. I was looking for a picture from a particular project where they got a load of large rocks out on the project. They had 2 piles, one that was clean, one that had a lot of dirt in it. The pile with the dirt had to be covered. In this particular case, this was fine gravel. If you're unsure of whether something needs to be covered, just pick up a handful, drop it in the breeze. If you see a bunch of dust coming off, it needs to be covered. Now we're going to talk about some of the stockpiles that have some special requirements. Landscape mulch. This is organic material. This is the one time we'll take covering that pile with fabric instead of plastic. Organic material, as it decomposes, creates heat. The plastic will hold that heat in much more than the fabric. However, the best thing you can do is never stockpile mulch on your project. If you do have to cover it for the night or the weekend, use it as soon as possible. Cold patch and waste asphalt. They are petroleum-based products. They are not to be stored directly on the ground, nor can they be mixed in with your spoil piles. They need to be covered, and you need to have perimeter protection around them. I recommend you put them on steel plates. That way, when your loader comes in to scoop it up, you're not getting a load of plastic with it. Rebar and galvanized steel. AR 1155 says cover building materials to prevent contact with rainwater. In 209 and your SWIP template, it says such as rebar and galvanized poles. Should read galvanized steel. They become point sources of pollution. To prevent contact with rainwater, you should rack it off the ground and cover it. Here's an example of covering rebar. The upper slide shows rebar racked, but it's not covered. If you're lucky enough to be at the viaduct, you can use the viaduct as cover in this case. However, it still needs to be racked off the ground. If you've ever been under the viaduct in a rainstorm, you know that the scuppers dump tremendous amounts of water under there. Hazardous material. These require, These require special disposal, which means you're probably going to have it on your site for a while. One of the things is all this creosote we find around. A lot of our projects are digging up the old railroad ties. If they're individual ties, they're easy to rack. If you have to take them out in pieces, it's not so easy. Easiest thing to do is get a trash bin, throw it in there and cover it. If not, you're going to have to wrap the whole thing up. Foam poles are creosote. Here's an example of correction. Notice the pallets on the left that they're resting on. They also included some of the old guardrail, which is galvanized steel, and covered it. Transite pipes. Occasionally, we dig these up on projects. These are asbestos-based. They date back to 1929 when they were first created. Check with your safety professional in terms of removal and storage and disposal. Usually, you just wrap it up and hold it till you can get rid of it. We mentioned some other staging area requirements or issues. Perimeter control, concrete washouts, portable toilets, construction entrances, and inlets. Jersey barriers are not perimeter control. This is not a staging area photo, but it gives an example of what we're talking about. There are gaps in between the Jersey barriers. There's also the pukas underneath where the pick points are. You'll end up with sediment on the other side of the Jersey barriers. You need to look beyond your project. When your project stops at point A, you need to look beyond to point B. If you have a staging area, you need to check the surrounding area. This particular staging area, and there's nothing really hazardous about a bunch of Jersey barriers there, but there is a natural swale that runs behind them down to an inlet. Perimeter control is not a platform to store construction materials on top of. You need to keep them away from your perimeter control, otherwise they're going to bring them down or damage them. Washouts. These things are supposed to be, the location is supposed to be in your SWIP. They need to be watertight. You must have sufficient capacity. Now I'm going to give you some examples of some of these things. Obviously, they didn't have sufficient capacity when they laid out their kiddie pools. There were actually 5 more out there. What I recommend is figure out how many you need, then bring out a bunch more. The other thing is, even with commercial washouts, best thing to do is put plastic under it and berm it. Besides having at least one driver who can't aim come onto your project site. Even the commercial ones leak. That makes cleanup a lot easier. Waste concrete is not treated as a spoil pile, folks. Covering it doesn't make it okay. It needs to be cleaned up when wet. If you're doing concrete work, have something for your waste concrete if the washout isn't close by. I would not recommend using the top of the sand barrels as they used on the right. They wobble. When you clean out your washout, you may also have a spoil pile that requires covering. Again, this is based on how many fines are in there. This one has a tremendous amount of fines of pulverized concrete. They can be picked up with wind or rain. So this is a pile you either need to get it off your site or you need to cover it and put perimeter control. Portable toilets. It may not seem like it belongs here, but that is an issue that we've had on occasion. These things tip over. You do not have a stormwater discharge. You've got a sewage spill, folks. They're light. They blow over. This actually blew over, but this contractor was extremely lucky. It had just been serviced. It blew over on its back and had a trap. So we were able to look inside and determine nothing had leaked. You can tie it down. You can stake it down. Put it in some place where the wind won't get it. Construction entrances. Again, all points that exit onto paved roads. The size of the manual says 30 by 50 feet. On some projects, that might be a whole project area. So you can scale it to the size of your project, provided you stipulate the size in your SWIP. Rock needs to be 3 to 6. And consider alternative commercial stuff. This is the genesis of a traditional entrance. Dig down 12 inches, line it with fabric, throw the rock in. Here are two commercial alternatives. The geoterra grid on the left and track out plates on the right. I went on a project, I told them, you need to have a construction entrance here. They had geoterra mats from a previous project. It was down the next day. They're more expensive, but consider the labor savings. And you can pick it up and take it with you. Same thing with track out plates. Track out plates, one of the things I advise you is make sure you channel all your traffic over them, because if there's a way to drive around them, they will. Because if you've ever driven over them, you know that they jar your teeth. There's a combination on the left, a rock construction entrance with a track out plate. On the right, this is a picture I took from a catalog. You got some vendors out there, folks. Talk to them. There are a lot of new stuff out there. It may be more expensive than the rock, but you might save time and labor. Inlet protection. As I said, you need to check the downslope. If you have an inlet that's outside your project area, but you're driving past it every day to get into your staging area with loads of dirt, you probably need to protect that inlet. Then you need to add this to your SWIP. Again, there are a whole host of BMPs out there that you can use for inlet protection. Again, I just took pictures from various catalogs. I cannot tell you how any of these work, except I have seen the drain donuts used on projects. So this is not an endorsement, it's just to show you there's a whole slew of products out there. Again, talk to the vendors out there. Try something. Don't go whole hog, but try something to see if it works. It might be better than what we're using now.